there's happiness in terms of self-satisfaction, which is what well-being often means. And then there's happiness in a Christian perspective, which should always be in conversation with joy as a fruit of the Spirit, which I think is slightly different in tone. It's much more open, and it's much less about oneself and one's own satisfaction, and more about one's openness and the breadth of one's experience and one's communing with other people.
Welcome to Into the Truth, the podcast from the Catholic Truth Society. And my name is Pier Paolo Finaldi. I'm the CEO and publisher of the CTS and your host for this podcast. I'm very pleased to be able to welcome Professor Jacob Phillips to the podcast today. Welcome, Jacob.
Good morning. Thanks for having me on.
So Jacob Phillips is a professor of systematic theology at St Mary's University, Twickenham, and works across a diverse range of areas, and particularly concerned with issues of human self-understanding, subjectivity, conscience and obedience, with particular reference to the work of Joseph Ratzinger and John Henry Newman. And we are going to be speaking a little bit about what makes for the Catholic vision of human flourishing, and how the kind of world has sort of come into that area and has brought in some other influences. So we'll talk through that. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
So tell us a little bit about yourself, because you got into sort of Catholic academia quite young, and what had been your sort of journey in faith terms up to then?
Well, I'm a convert. I was brought up Baptist, so an evangelical upbringing, and the Baptist Church, strangely, do not baptise children. So you're given the choice in your sort of early teens, confirmation age, if you want to be baptised. And I was going through the usual sort of adolescent rebellion stuff around the faith, and decided I didn't want to be baptised. So was without faith, really, from early teens up until my early 20s. I had, I suppose, a typically kind of misspent youth with lots of partying and stuff. And then in my early 20s, just found myself getting very interested in questions like, does God exist? What's the purpose of my life? All that kind of stuff. So I was baptised at 24, initially into the Church of England. And after 3 years in that interim period, if you like, I was received into the Catholic Church in 2008 when I was about 28.
So what had kind of sparked your interest initially in those sort of early 20s into Christianity?
Gosh, yes. Well, I was just looking for purpose and meaning, really, and I was the world in which I was in, and the people in which I knew all seemed a bit lost and didn't really know where they were going, and you kind of wonder what's it all for and what's it all about. And those questions led naturally into reading about spirituality of different sorts and different traditions. And I just remember at a certain point reading a few things that just made me think, God must actually exist. God must really exist. And I was actually slightly crestfallen in that moment, because I realised that I believed in God and I was going to have to do something about it. And I just found the Christian, and particularly Catholic, although I became Anglican in the first place, it was Catholic theological and spiritual writings that really grabbed my imagination. And I just found the Catholic way of accounting for God, the world and humanity an incredibly rich, broad, compelling, fertile and exciting worldview that I just felt compelled to sort of dedicate myself to as much as I could, really.
And did the kind of theological studies, did they come after that, or was that kind of part of what had piqued your interest?
Yeah, it was all kind of mixed up, really. So because I'd started reading theology, I enrolled on an evening course in theology with Birkbeck that was a sort of non-denominational introduction to Christian theology. And it was around that time that I was baptised, sort of a year or two into that. And then I started an undergraduate degree at Heathrow College, a Catholic Jesuit college within the University of London, and feeling very frustrated with the Church of England. It was reading Augustine's Confessions, where I became convinced that conversion to the Catholic Church was the only option. And I approached the tutor of that module, actually, who was an elderly Jesuit, one of those old Jesuits that wore the collar and stuff, called Father Anthony Meredith, who's sadly no longer with us. And he and I met once a week in the first half of 2008, and then I was received into the church that July.
So, I mean, in a sense, you had sort of encountered the meaning crisis kind of before it was cool. There's much talk about it now. Do you see what's kind of happening at the moment? We're this Easter. There were lots of articles in the press, especially in Britain, about a big uptick in interest in Christianity, especially among the young. Do you see that situation as kind of slightly different now as when you had encountered it, or is it this kind of similar pressures and questions swirling around?
Yes, I mean, I feel very close to it, really. I mean, my story was slightly different. It's 20 years ago, really, so it was a different time. But I do feel very close to it, and I feel I understand where people are coming from. I mean, for me, it was very much a reflection of the sort of 90s hedonism, I suppose Epicurean, if you wanted to give it a philosophical name, the pursuit of pleasure and self-satisfaction, and how empty and dry and ultimately destructive that became. I think today people would think more in terms of how lots of old certainties have slipped away politically, culturally, and people are looking for new certainties, which I think is true. What frustrates me about some of the commentary is people neglect the fact that what Catholicism offers is a very compelling alternative. That's the reason why people are interested in it, on the strength of the message. It's not simply that people have been complaining about a crisis of meaning for 50 years. Mm-hmm. What we have now is a moment where I think the Catholic witness is speaking to that moment in a particularly vivid way, and that's really exciting.
As you said, this meaning crisis has kind of loomed large for a long time now, and the world's response has been very much to kind of put sort of front and center a certain way of viewing the human person and a certain way of speaking about our experiences, and I think it would be really interesting to explore the way that the whole kind of well-being therapy, sort of therapeutic mindset has become part of our kind of everyday parlance. Those sort of the terminology that would once have belonged to a darkened room with somebody lying on a couch has become sort of part of even sort of children's programs. The amount of times you see denial and all these sort of things that mentioned even in children's cartoons. So I mean, take us a bit through how you see that kind of happened and what's been the effect of that.
Yeah, so I think in the first place, there's this sort of we have to look at what a dramatic change this is, which you've just spoken about. I mean, if you go on Google Books and do the Ngram search of the word well-being, it's kind of pretty steady until we get to the noughties. It kind of goes up a bit, and then around 2010, it's cliff edge, straight up, and it's still rising. And I think you'd only have to go back 30, 40 years to imagine a conversation with someone in which if you asked what the impact of something was on your well-being, they wouldn't really know what you were talking about, where this came from, or why you were thinking about what it means for your ability to be well, for this to have happened. So as a cultural phenomenon, I find that really interesting, and theologically, I always find it very interesting to look at the intersection of movements in culture and how theology can relate to those. I mean, I say this hesitantly because it's a complex issue, but the reality is, statistically, empirically, there is very clear data to show that in the last 15 or 20 years at which talking about well-being and mental health has become incredibly widespread and embedded within the culture, people are feeling less well than they ever have before. So you've got this cliff edge going up about language about well-being and awareness of well-being and how it's okay not to be okay and all this kind of stuff. At exactly the same time, the stats on mental well-being are cliff edging down. So there seems to be some sort of strange relationship between the two, which I find fascinating. And I think these are ultimately theological questions. What does it mean for us as human beings to be well? Now, the church moves through different times and different periods of history, and if we go back a generation or two, it was movements for social reform and left-wing politics, and Marxism was the main thing that the church was responding to in the culture. Now I think this is one of the main things the church needs to respond to, and as with previous movements, it's important for us to be aware that it's not something that I think is entirely neutral. It looks neutral. You look at it and you think, why wouldn't we want to be well? And we as Catholics want people to be well. and we ourselves want to be well. So surely there's a Zen diagram where there's more or less an exact sort of overlap between language of well-being and the Catholic account of human flourishing and meaning and so on. I'm not sure that that's really the case. And I think if we unpick what well-being actually means, and if we read those who cultural commentators on it, if you like, they've unearthed some really interesting aspects of it, which would suggest that it's not quite as neutral as it seems.
Yeah, can we just distinguish one thing? Because I think, if we did go back, 30 years and speak to somebody about well-being, I would imagine that their initial reaction would be that you're talking about health.
Mm.
And it seems to me that I don't know, I wouldn't necessarily say that we've sort of solved that issue, but that issue seems to be one which either the kind of technological paradigm gives us, the feeling that we can sort that one out, so we need to move on to the next thing. Is that kind of how you'd see the sort of division between the two things?
Yeah, I think so. And really, I mean, if you look at these things philosophically, language of mental health is a problem because you're importing a metaphor from physical health into the realm of ideas and subjectivity, and it's difficult. We tend to assume through the culture at large that these two are broadly coextensive and one can be transposed to the other, but I think they're fundamentally different things. I think it's very difficult to quantify and say confidently that one's being is well in the same way you can say physically one is well. I think it's much harder really just to look at well-being as something that's easily definable in the way that physical health is, and that's part of the problem here.
So when you're talking about this, you can explain this kind of analogy a bit more, how that kind of works and doesn't work.
Well, I mean, as human beings, one of the sort of fundamental questions in philosophy of mind is the degree to which the brain is or the degree to which mind, consciousness and subjectivity are physically rooted. They clearly can't be distinguished entirely from the physical, but there's a huge amount about the experience of what it is to be human which simply can't be captured within the empirical paradigm, which in Catholic theology we would think of as the soul, and our being made in the image of God, and all these things which aren't empirically quantifiable. So insofar as our conscious experience is ultimately the experience of our soul within us, if you like, it's not something which we can necessarily cause to be in a state of fitness like we can the body. It's not something which we can easily categorize as well or unwell as we can with physical fitness. The two are just fundamentally very different things.
Just for the kind of non-specialist, when you talk about subjectivity, what are we talking about?
Well, here I mean our experience of ourselves, really, which is what it is to be a subject, i.e. a conscious creature who is a subject of experience and aware of that experience.
So how closely does that map onto the current buzzword of lived experience?
Well, they're very closely related, and I actually got interested initially in discourse around well-being due to my frustration with identity politics.
Right.
The two are very closely related, and I became increasingly convinced that what was driving it on a more fundamental level, what was driving the political fixation on identity, was a set of presuppositions about well-being. Lived experience, as it's used in the discourse, means the idea that the way that someone experiences reality has a validity simply by virtue of it being what you experience, rather than by virtue of whether it corresponds with the truth of what actually happened. And it's based on the presupposition, which comes from the world of well-being, if you like, that the way someone experiences something is valid and should be discussed and should be expressed, which is exactly what happens. You mentioned the darkened room with the psychotherapist. That's exactly what happens in therapy. It almost doesn't really matter what the reality of the situation is to an extent. It matters how you felt subject to what happened. So well-being ultimately, I think, if one were to define it the way it's used in the culture at large, it really means one's inward sense of self and feeling satisfied in one's inward sense of self. And very closely related to that is this presupposition, which was named very well by someone called Charles Taylor as expressive individualism, which is that meaning is found ultimately through the ability to freely express your inner sense of self and who you think you are, your authentic self, your core identity.
Which became a huge thing in the world of art or music. It's all about you express yourself, say who you really are. But this has come then into kind of society at large and has sort of caused some real issues with regard to, I suppose, the most obvious thing that would come to mind is questions of gender, for example, and expressing, or furries or whatever it happens to be. So how did we get from where self-expression was something that kind of belonged to a certain class of creatives maybe, or something, to something that became much more kind of widespread? How did that happen?
Yeah, I mean, it's an incredibly complex thing to try and map. It's clear, I mean, I agree with you that what we go from a sort of elite avant-garde discussions to the mainstreaming and normalising of this stuff in the culture at large. I think there's lots of factors involved. I think, it's very much a Western phenomenon, so we've got advertising and consumerism tied up in all this. It's hugely beneficial to people who are marketing goods and images and clothes and identities for them to play on the idea that we all have a certain something which we can be satisfied with if we acquire this good.
Express your individuality by buying this mass-produced item.
And this will show the world who you really are. That's a big factor in it, sort of economically. We've then got sort of digital technology and the way algorithms work, which perpetuate this kind of inner sense of direction by feeding it and fueling it and forming lots of multifarious conflicting identities where people feel that they're surrounded and they're finally understood and they're finally validated. But then also, I think there's something which is, I think it's important for us to bear in mind, really, as Catholics living in the contemporary Western world, which is that this stuff has become the primary presupposition, if you like, a kind of pseudo-spirituality in the corporate world. We have what some would call the HR-ification of society. HR departments are sort of like the new chaplaincies, in a way, giving spiritual direction through values and trite, meaningless statements about authenticity and being yourself and,
bringing your whole self to work.
Bringing your whole self to work and all this kind of stuff. And in education, it's beyond endemic. I mean, it's at the core of contemporary educational institutions, I think, all these presuppositions around well-being.
I mean, there's something that I thought was very interesting. You said that in the Christian tradition, these things are very close to what we've called the soul. So I'm always kind of interested to see where, it's often said that what the church kind of lays down or sort of forgets, the world picks up and then kind of mangles up. Do you think that, did we sort of take our eye off the ball and stop speaking about the soul so that the world started speaking about something similar to it?
Yes, and I think the church often does that in the way you've described it. So with the election of Pope Leo XIV, lots of people have been talking about Rerum Novarum. That's a really good example of the church picking up concern for the poor, when that concern for the poor has been, I wouldn't say hijacked, but perhaps neglected by the church and taken in different directions which do not map onto the Venn diagram as neatly as people think they do with the church. And we definitely see that with well-being and with the soul and with an account of human flourishing offered by the church, which I think the church has the discourse and the means of approach that we have in the church is often forgetting how compelling the vision we have to offer the world is.
So, I mean, what would you say was the sort of the discourse that the church had about kind of human flourishing, about the human person, soul included, how they could kind of reach happiness and find meaning, and why did that sort of fade away a bit?
Well, I think the first place to start, as we mentioned at the beginning, with anything like this is St Augustine, and what's called the Augustinian inquietum, which means a restlessness, and it's from a very famous paragraph in Augustine's Confessions, in which he says, "Our hearts are restless until they rest in thee." Now, what the teaching of the Confessions and what the inquietum refers to is that it's a completely natural, important, and irremovable feature of human life that we want to be happy, and we should want to be happy. And we need to remember that, Catholicism, the caricature of Catholicism, of old, was that it was kind of morbid and solemn and all about suffering and didn't really think that people should be happy. That's clearly not the case. What Augustine said, remarkably, considering he was writing at the very end of the 4th century, what he said is that this desire to be happy has been planted into our souls, into our hearts by God. God wants us to be happy because God wants to receive the free gift of our love. For reasons which we can never know nor understand, God passionately desires the free offering of our love. So he plants in our soul this desire to be happy. Now, because of pride, because of original sin, because of our ignorance and our blindness and the waywardness of human societies, we try to satisfy that desire to be happy through finite things. And again, although it's written at the end of the 4th century, it remains to this day by far the most compelling account of addiction, which is what drove, the world of addiction drove this takeover of well-being language. It remains to this day the most incredible account of addiction, I think, which is that we try to satisfy that desire to be happy through finite things, and because it's been planted into our hearts by God, it can only be satisfied by that which is infinite. So when you try to fill an infinite hole with a finite object, you need more and more and more and more, and it becomes entirely destructive of the self, because you can never get there. You get to this sort of salt water phenomenon where people drink salt water and they just get thirstier and thirstier, but it never satisfies it. So I think it's really fundamental to keep that in mind, that it's right and proper for us to want to be happy. But it's equally important to bear in mind that there's happiness in terms of self-satisfaction, which is what well-being often means, and then there's happiness in a Christian perspective, which should always be in conversation with joy as a fruit of the Spirit, which I think is slightly different in tone. It's much more open, and it's much less about oneself and one's own satisfaction, and more about one's openness and the breadth of one's experience and one's communing with other people.
So, Augustine, he's very early, and often people speak about him as, the first writer in the area of psychology, because he's the first one who really sort of writes in an introspective way, thinking about his own thoughts and his own feelings and memories and the effect of his childhood on the rest of his life. But what was he kind of building on, especially going back to what maybe even Christ says about it in the Gospels?
Well, the 2 Psalms, which are deeply reminiscent of Augustine's spirituality, I can't remember the exact numbers. I think one is 41, which is like the deer that yearns for running streams. I thirst for you, oh my God. That's just so rich in the tone, this restlessness and this searching for this thirst, which can only be quenched by God. And then the other one, I think, is 61 or 62. Oh God, you are my God, for you I long, for you my soul is thirsting. So they're the core, the kind of scriptural core of Augustinian spirituality, I would say. What we have in Scripture is that it's very clear from Scripture that we have a core, authentic identity. We do have that, and it's acutely personal, and it's acutely individual. You see it in Psalm, I think it's 139, before and behind you besiege me, you knit me together in my mother's womb. You see it in Isaiah, when Isaiah talks about being called from the womb, set apart from the womb. And you see it particularly in some comments of St Paul, for example, in Colossians, he says, our lives are hidden with Christ in God. And in Galatians 2:20, he says, it's no longer I who live, but I'm dying with Christ. What all of these scriptural references have is the fact that any sort of encounter or awareness of this core identity we have are in a sense of self. Or it can only be encountered in truth, can only be beheld in truth through a dialogue with God, through a third term. So there's I and myself gazing upon each other. We can never get there. If I bring God into that conversation, then we get some sense of who we really are. And it might not be something that, Paul says our lives are hidden with Christ in God. So it might not be something that we can necessarily articulate or feel confident about in ourselves. But there's a sense that really human life or human self-awareness is a conversation with God. To be born is to be entered into a lifelong embodied conversation with He who created you and passionately desires the free offer of your love in return for that creation and to be shared for all eternity. And what the Confessions does is it's autobiography, but it's autobiography written as a transcript of a conversation with God. And that's the only way you can do Christian or Catholic autobiography. It can never be, I felt this, I did this happened. the whole thing is addressed in the second person to God. And that's it. What it tells us is, if it is the founding text of psychology, great, because it tells us that finding meaning and truth in human psychology is something that happens only through discoursing with God.
I think that's a fascinating thing that you brought up there, because it seems to me that there's a sort of tension between the fact that in the end we are all searching for the same thing, and this idea of individuality. Because I think what the world of today seems to say is, no, we're all different. We're all on a spectrum. We all have to find, you do you. Everything has to be kind of very much geared to a particular experience. Whereas St Augustine, the Psalms, St Paul there is a kind of universalizing of that experience. We all feel this, inquietude, or this whole and the answer is always, in a sense, the same answer. And yet, in what you were saying, there is definitely the recognition that there is an individual, I don't know if it's an individual journey or an individual way that journey from inquietude to discovery of God is experienced. So can you say something to that? Because it seems to me that the reason why a lot of people might dismiss Christianity or dismiss Catholicism is that, but that's just like a sort of one size fits all. Whereas we're all trying to be, we all are individuals and very much trying to be that.
Mm. Yes, I think the Christian account of vocation and things like that suggest that we have, to a certain extent, a personal mission, which is God's will for us, and all that kind of language which Newman put famously into a wonderful prayer. I think we have to be realistic. Newman says, I may not know what my purpose is. He seems to be saying that to be Christian, to be Catholic, is to trust that God is using you for his purposes, which are for your good and the good of his creation and the good of fellow man and the world at large. And it may not be given to you in this life to know what that purpose is, but to trust in it, and to trust that it is acutely personal, and that God knows all there is to be known about you yourself, and everything you could have thought, possibly thought, will do, etc., etc. Where I guess there's a difference from the psychotherapeutic paradigm, an important difference here, I think, is that much of the thinking that's come to us in this world, of this discourse around well-being, is that the encountering meaning comes from foregoing collective and communal commitments, from escaping them. And the one thing that you'll never hear HR departments talking about is the good of conformity. What's very interesting, paradoxically very different in the Christian world, is it's through adopting basic, irremovable kind of dogmatic presuppositions in the Catholic faith, through an act of conformity, that we do find something, or can trust in the knowledge that we're living with something that is acutely personal and acutely unique as a response to that. Ratzinger said the opening line of the Creed, I believe in God, the Father Almighty, is a very powerful statement of conformity. It's to say, I do not invent reality. Reality isn't something I can discover for myself. Reality is something which exists before and beyond me and is far beyond my reckoning, and I need to conform to it. But that act of conformity is one in which our lives, our true lives, are hidden with Christ in God in some way.
Yeah, whereas I think what we see as the answer in the kind of modern view of reality is that, we create reality, and if we think that one thing it needs to be like that, we can harness technology and all sorts of other tools at our fingertips to create or to recreate reality to match that, and that's caused all kinds of difficulties.
Yeah, it has, and technology is really key in all of this,
Right.
because what the well-being world and the therapeutic paradigm offers us is what one commentator has called a technology of the emotions. So if you get your steps in, and you eat whatever we're meant to be eating this week, and you do all the right things and affirmations and all this kind of stuff, we're manipulating the human body, this kind of physical paradigm of well-being, and we can be well and we can sort of optimize ourselves. And it's what the outcome of this is, and one of the things that most troubles me about the world of well-being is just how profoundly individualistic it is. It's been pointed out that in pre-modernity, really before the modern age, one of the reasons why the concept of individual well-being or individual self-satisfaction was completely alien was because the well-being of the individual was completely caught up with the well-being of the community itself. So with the polis in ancient Greece, and in Christendom, with the well-being of the church community, the parish, and so on. And maybe later a bit more in terms of nation and culture. What we have now is this idea that one's acquisition of well-being, one feeling satisfied with oneself, not only happens without the participation of the community, but it's achieved by alienating oneself from the community, by not conforming, by taking oneself away from the world of norms and expectations and things like that. And the word dogma, which for us as Catholics is a wonderfully beautiful and rich term, becomes a pejorative term, being dogmatic. And in that sense, it's as I say, it's not neutral. In many ways, it's working in a way that's completely counter to what the Catholic faith professes.
So that's an interesting kind of thing to explore, perhaps, is the sort of the loss of the communal sense. And I would say, I mean, you didn't mention the family, but I presume that's kind of at the base of all of this as well, because it seems that, in terms of, rebelling against the family, finding your own kind of individuality outside it has ended up with a massive kind of crisis whereby people, you have sort of the stats on, Gen Z not wanting to have children because in a sense it kind of ties you down to so that you won't actually be able to find that individual kind of well-being. Is that?
Yeah, completely. Right? Yeah. I should have mentioned family. I meant to. Family is absolutely key here, because today often the word family in the world of psychology and well-being and stuff is spoken of, again, pejoratively, like the word dogma. And the family is said to be a place where there are all these kinds of expectations which might respect one's individuality. And also, strangely, in a way I find very frustrating, is often presented as the locus of where most abuse happens as well, forgetting the importance of family breakdown for the trajectory of those who are, unfortunately, tragically enough, caught up in situations of abuse. So I think the way in which the family has been sort of problematized by the younger generations at the moment is completely symptomatic of this. The reality is, I know you're a dad, if you've accompanied a woman through childbirth and if you've experienced child rearing, it's not going to bring you a sense of satisfaction with your inner sense of self. It's going to do quite the opposite. You're going to be deprived of sleep. You're going to be frustrated. You're going to watch your dearly beloved wife in huge amounts of pain and possibly danger of premature death and have to experience emergency C-sections. And this will be ongoing for life because you've sort of, if in a sense, you've delegated your emotional well-being to the well-being of others. That's what Christianity is. It's exactly what Christianity is. It's to say that my joy is bound up with love of others. And I get so frustrated when I see stuff by my dearly beloved friends who are Gen Z saying that they can't possibly have children because for financial reasons and stuff like that. I do understand the problems with the housing crisis, and I understand how difficult things are for that generation, and I understand it's more difficult than it was for mine. But the reality is, what would human history be like if people had decided it wasn't financially optimum to have children at that moment in history? Well, there'd be very few of us left. People... It work. When you have kids, it works out. You find a way. You'll know this as well as anyone.
Yeah.
And I think it would be a very strange turn of events, really, for humanity if in Western countries people just decided it wasn't in their best interest to have children. I mean, what a tragedy.
And I got to say, the experience of having children is very much kind of turning your own happiness to somebody else. The moment when I'm happiest is when I see my children being happy. It's a very strange kind of you really don't belong to yourself anymore, and seeing your children being happy with each other or having a great experience, it's way better than having that great experience yourself in a kind of strange way, and it goes completely against that type of sort of turned in on yourself kind of paradigm of well-being that we see in the world, isn't it?
Yeah, no, it really does. And that, that whole pursuit of self-optimization through diet and sleep and exercise and having a bit of time with yourself, a bit of mindfulness and feeling right with oneself. You can't do any of that around young kids. And the joy that's given to you on the other side of that is just remarkable.
You brought up mindfulness. I've been very interested in that because, it suddenly appeared, I don't know, probably about 10, 15 years ago, and quite quickly was being practiced even in Catholic institutions and schools and things. What's your sort of view of mindfulness, where it's kind of come from and what it's done?
Well, I don't feel I can sort of pronounce definitely at this stage sort of if there isn't scope for more of a Zen diagram than there is with well-being generally.
Right.
I suppose going back to your question about has the church neglected things which society at large has taken off and run awry with. I suppose in terms of the reality of living daily life in the presence of God is something that perhaps has been neglected by the church at large, certainly after the council. Maybe mindfulness has sort of moved into that space. I mean, I think I remain open to the possibility there can be such a thing as Christian mindfulness. A very dear friend of mine is completely convinced of this case, and I suppose in that sense one would think of it as a sort of intentionality and a living in the presence of God, rather than simply living in a mindful presence of intentionality with oneself. You get to that triangulation of the confessions again. If you're being mindful of living in the presence of God, then I can imagine it could be a very good thing, but it often isn't. And it's often seen as another route to self-optimization and productivity, and again this increase in processing speed, these kind of technological paradigm ways of thinking about it, and that makes me very uneasy because the Catholic account of human flourishing is not about what we've done, and it's not about necessarily what we're achieving and how productive we're being. It's about the degree to which our lives are rooted in God.
One thing that I sort of looking at the things that you've written about this, I'm quite interested in where technology and I suppose medicine as a type of technology, where do these kind of interact? Because it seems it is with our own kind of well-being. Because I think there's a general, certainly with all the questions that there are about mental health, we're definitely in a period where that gets medicalized and lots of people are more people are on those kinds of drugs than ever before, and yet I think there's definitely a sense that that's a dangerous thing. Where do we kind of see, especially within the church, where I think we obviously we accept that medicine has its place, but how can we kind of avoid looking just for that sort of technological solution?
Yes, it's a very good question, and I move into this area quite hesitantly. I talk about it quite hesitantly because many people will be in receipt of will be mental health service users of some description, and I'm not qualified to tell people what decisions they should or shouldn't make on that front. I think you're right. I mean, we've seen this a change in the world of physical health from a response to physical pathologies or illnesses where there's an intervention for the sake of maintaining health, and a sense that health is something stable and solid, which is a given, and then a doctor intervenes if something goes wrong. That's changed into sort of the world of preventativeness and this spectrum of fitness, and we're supposed to be thinking every day about how we can optimize our health through the way we eat and we sleep and so on. Exactly the same has happened in the world of mental health, where it's gone from psychological pathologies like hearing voices and stuff like that, and an intervention, to now a sense that we're on this spectrum of mental health.
So we're all kind of getting towards some kind of pathology, but we just have to kind of make sure that we sort of stay on the right side of things, by doing X, Y, and Z.
And this is why we're not allowed to call people mad anymore.
Right.
Because if you say someone's mad, you're saying there are agreed norms, and this person is existing outside of their norms, and their consciousness is defective or pathological in some way. So I think the decline of our ability to speak about madness is hugely indicative as to what's happened in society. where the church can inform that, I mean, I think there's someone called Philip Reef, who was a cultural commentator he came up with the idea of a therapeutic age, and he called the contemporary person psychological man. He had this very interesting comment where he's saying genuine well-being brings with it freedom from the single criterion of well-being. So to be well is self-forgetting. It's to forget to be concerned with your own wellness at every minute of every hour of every day, and to be caught up in human life and in sharing in the divine life with God. So where the church could move into this space is I think it needs to be careful not to... I say what it needs to be careful with in the first place, which is, if we could think about, again, a Zen diagram, there is a tendency in much discourse in the Catholic sphere to assume that human formation and spiritual formation almost entirely overlap. I think they're a little bit further apart. I'm not saying there isn't an overlap, but I'm saying it's possible to be spiritually formed by God and to be profoundly holy and have various red flags on the area of human formation. I think some saints weren't particularly emotionally stable. I think some of them were very difficult people, and I think they weren't very socially integrated. What well-being tells us is that we need emotional stability must come before all else, and we must be socially integrated, but that's through a family of our own association rather than origin. So I think the church needs to unpick how much of this discourse isn't neutral, and to outline an alternative vision and get people to be aware, really, that how you feel, the degree to which you feel satisfied with your own emotional state, ultimately doesn't really matter. Well, it shouldn't really matter if things are going okay.
Because there's something greater that we're kind of aiming at.
Yeah. What if we think of that Augustine sort of triangulation and Psalm 139 and everything, what matters is the way that God is thinking of us. That's what really matters. Now, obviously, if one is upset or struggling and all the rest of it, that needs to be looked at. But that should be seen not as a constant task of fitness on that sort of, with that sort of mentality, that paradigm mentality, but something's gone awry and I need to look at this and give it some attention, and then I can move on. The general state, if you like, the sort of Greenwich Mean Time default setting of human consciousness for the Catholic, if you like, should come from the fact that what really matters is how God is looking on us. We come into existence by virtue of the fact that God thought about us. It's an awesome thing that we can never fully understand, that God continues to think about us perpetually every moment of our lives, and he offers the ability to be inscribed within his life for all eternity. And in pondering those sorts of things, one would hope it really ceases to matter how I felt when I woke up this morning and if I felt okay with myself.
So is this sort of, because in the past, there's been certainly a bit of been moments where kind of Christians have been very obsessed with their own kind of working out their own salvation. Where am I? Am I in a state of grace? Am I, among the chosen? Am I the, one of those who's kind of destined for heaven or not? And I mean that's that kind of discourse, that kind of worry seems to have kind of passed into the background, to be replaced by the kind of worry about whether I'm fulfilled or kind of happy with myself. I mean, are those two bad things, or are they on a spectrum? Or
it's a really good question. I mean, I could understand how, particularly in the run-up to the council, there was a sense that Catholic spirituality was too profoundly individualistic in a way. I could see where those criticisms were coming from, and the suggestion was that people needed to be a bit more concerned about the well-being of the whole and the human family and the nation and the culture and the family, arguably, maybe. Although I think concern for the family was always there. I think there's some fairness in that criticism, and certainly in some of the caricatures of Catholic spirituality. In sort of 19th and early 20th century, there was something in that. In a sense, there's the corrective to individualism, well-being, could have some similarities with the corrective to the individualism of a sort of scrupulous piety. I do think there's a fundamental difference, though, because I think to engage with that, if you like, sort of traditional individualistic piety concerned for one's salvation. For those within the Catholic world, I don't think you can just think this is self-satisfaction or self-acquisition, or very rarely so. I mean, no one really knows the inner movements of one's heart, and it's possible for the most outwardly pious to be the most inwardly gravely deficient. But I think there's a fundamental difference, and I think you're really onto something when you say, Catholic discourse today, drawing from the culture, wanting to be compelling and seductive and all the rest of it, can very easily mistake life in Christ as fundamentally about self-fulfilment. And salvation can slip off into the background, particularly in speaking to the young, because you think, well, the young aren't faced with death, and the older we get, the more concerned with salvation we get, all that kind of stuff. If you read the New Testament, salvation isn't something that can be sort of shelved to worry about at a later date. It is front and centre, and in my experience of working with young people, salvation is absolutely key. They go straight in for salvation. So we need to be careful of neglecting salvation through the influence of the wellbeing world, I think.
So it's interesting that we're talking about this at a moment in which the question of suffering is very much within the kind of political discourse. There are movements in the UK to legalise euthanasia, assisted suicide, as a response to not really knowing what to do with suffering, and whether it has, well, basically having come to the conclusion that it has no real kind of value or meaning. Whereas, the whole kind of therapeutic discourse has sort of said, well, we need to resolve suffering. But the church has a kind of different story to tell. But how can that, without seeming to kind of glorify it, how do, or perhaps we can. I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. It's a really it's a live issue, and I was involved in writing a letter to the Member of Parliament for Twickenham, where my employer, St Mary's University, is, on behalf of a group of staff, to raise our concerns about so-called assisted dying. And some colleagues actually removed a sentence about suffering in that, because they felt it was glorifying suffering, and it was something seen as really problematic in the eyes of the world, and we shouldn't really go there. So I understand the issue here, and I speak as someone who isn't profoundly unwell or anything like that in the physical sense. So I don't want to be sort of kind of preaching to someone who is in that sort of tragic situation. But the reality is, with euthanasia and also with abortion as well, this idea that the primary purpose of human life is to feel an inward sense of self-satisfaction and well-being, to feel that you are individually well, and to be able to express that sense of well-being and that identity, they're very closely related to these life issues, because someone in the tragic situation of suffering with a terminal diagnosis, of course they don't feel an inner sense of self-satisfaction. But the Christian account of joy has space within the separation of the Zen diagram and everything St Augustine says, to be profoundly, tragically, heartbreakingly unhappy, and through that and in that to feel an intangible sense of the joy of the divine life in Christ. And that for reasons we can never understand, and which I can't as a theologian claim to make rational in any kind of human way, it would seem to be the case that God requires at times for us to experience profound unhappiness in order for us more truly to be able to behold his joy and the joy he has to offer us. And I think we need to, what's really important is for us to be able to speak about this in such a way that it's not sort of preachy and all that kind of stuff, and to really enter with people into those experiences of tragic suffering, and really to give those who experience that intangible sense of joy through suffering, really give them a chance to articulate it and to put that front and centre of our conversations in this extremely difficult area.
Yeah, because suffering is not absent from the life of Christ, and it's not unimportant. In fact, it's one of the most important. And when he speaks about us imitating him, he speaks about taking up our cross. And that just seems to be. I suppose that kind of discourse kind of sometimes becomes more central and less central to the way that the the church speaks. But I suppose at the moment we've sort of withdrawn a little bit from that. At the end of the 19th century, that was a huge part of the discourse. I mean, is that can we make the cross kind of cool again?
I think we have to, really. Yeah. I mean, we have to find a way of articulating this. It's part and parcel of the Christian experience. If we don't, we'll end up with becoming conformed to the world. And obviously the world seeks its own self-satisfaction and its own self-fulfilment and all that kind of stuff, and passes that on to us. And that isn't what's offered. Happiness in the sense of self-satisfaction, that isn't what we offer. We offer something which is unspeakably difficult, but so compelling and so beautiful that once you've even detected the whiff of it, it will never let you go.
Pope Francis in particular often used the image of the field hospital, that the church was a place where, those who had kind of were broken by their own experience or by society, could come for, I suppose the field hospital is where you go for that kind of initial, just stop the bleeding, make sure they don't die in this moment. But what would you say is the church's real could be the best response that we could have to this crisis, which is, certainly in the Western world is if anything kind of becoming worse and worse?
Yeah, it's a really difficult one, because the knee-jerk response of the church has been to find ways in which the sort of self-fulfilment paradigm overlaps with the Catholic faith, and I think perhaps we need to separate the two. Those Gen Zs we're hearing about who all turned up to be baptised at this Easter Vigil and broke all the records here in London, they're not coming because we're offering something a bit of glitter on what the world offers, and we're making it a bit spiritual. They're coming into the church because the church is offering something fundamentally different. And I think we need to
therapy with incense.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. And I think we need to do. I think we need to do that. There is scope for overlap. I mean, something like the Lent program, Exodus 90, for example. That has drawn quite a lot, I think, from the therapeutic recovery world, and done so in a way that I think is quite well theologically grounded, and it manages to inhabit that space quite well. But I think we need to, for someone turning up at church, we need to say, not so much we'll make you well, as you'll find here something that enables you to stop thinking about if you're well or not. Self-forgetting. That's what needs to be on offer. And I think the way that happens is through all the standard kind of bread and butter realities of Catholic life: scripture, tradition, magisterium, and the sacramental economy, and ultimately confession, which is something very different to what therapy is.
All of that kind of stuff. It definitely exists within a certain kind of discourse, also within the church. And I'm always kind of slightly worried about whether we've forgotten about things like, spiritual direction, say, and sort of replaced it with therapy. Now, I may be, grossly kind of caricaturing what has happened, but I do, I think even in my own experience, my wife in particular, it's become much more difficult to find, say, a spiritual director. Therapists, readily available all over the place. So, I mean, how do you think we can ensure that, therapy has its place, but also whether the church can offer like an alternative, and what that alternative might look like in the future?
Yes, I think I suppose one thing that may result from the culture at large having these presuppositions is the fact that there will need to be more widespread provision of sort of mentoring or spiritual direction, done very much within the framework of Catholic theology and the Catholic Church and what it teaches, as distinguished from therapy. I think, people say it's very difficult to find a spiritual director and to get one, and it's not part of kind of normal Catholic life. I think that probably needs to change. I guess there's a lot to be said about what shape spiritual direction takes. Many people would sort of give it a sort of coaching relationship today, which again I'm uncomfortable with insofar as coaching, it's come from sport. It's about self-optimisation, or it's about optimization with another in the Catholic faith. I mean, I have a spiritual director, and my experience of spiritual direction is complete. It really could not be fitted into that sort of coaching or therapy type mindset at all. And at first I wondered if this was really what spiritual direction should be like. I don't know how comparable it is to other forms of spiritual direction, but to me, I don't know. I think that, Catholic life often doesn't look like, if you come in as an adult convert, Catholic life doesn't look like what you think it will look like. And it doesn't reveal itself in ways the world expects it to be. I mean, for me, entering the church at 28 in the noughties, and going to weekday mass, and there were sort of 5 or 6 old ladies at the 9:30 mass. I mean, there was nothing that was being portrayed to me in the way the world views things that could possibly be about self-advancement or self-optimization. And yet I felt this sense that this is where I had to be, and that this is where God wanted me to be. So I think the church really needs to trust, be less sort of kowtowing and trying to convince the world that we can do what the world does only better, and just simply be itself and proclaim the truth and let that truth radiate itself. And in this discussion about Gen Zs that we touched upon at the beginning, it's not because of populism and the housing crisis and stuff that people are being baptized. That crisis of meaning has always been there. It's because of what's on offer through baptism, which calls people to share in it.
So in that sense, to be true to the church's own kind of tradition and way of doing things would be the answer. I mean, one thing that I often think is people will read about the great spiritual directors that you read about in the lives of the saints. So, John of Avila, or, the spiritual directors of St Faustina that she talks about a lot, and say, well, this was what kind of helped them to sanctity. Is that what we, can I find that today? And I often find that I think that maybe we need to kind of have that laser-like focus that those spiritual or find that laser-like focus that those spiritual directors did on that one thing, which was to be holy, and that you won't get from a therapist necessarily.
No, exactly. I think that's right. And I guess the task of the spiritual director is to cultivate that laser-like focus, which it's very difficult for us who are so caught up in ourselves to distinguish that from this chimera, if you like, of well-being. Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth in that. And Catholicism is an incredibly rich thing. It's a lifestyle. It's not coming from a Protestant background. I could have been a very devout Baptist. I wouldn't really do much between 11:30 on a Sunday and 10 o'clock the following Sunday. There's not really much to do. I mean, you read the Bible and you pray, and maybe there's a house group. Catholicism gives you loads of really concrete things to do. Adoration, rosary, the office, daily mass. There's a huge amount that can be done. And I think the church needs to sometimes remind itself that these simple features, these practical features of the Catholic lifestyle, if you like, are incredibly rich and incredibly enriching in people's lives. And in and of themselves, they're enough. I mean, how could anything need to be more than the Mass?
Brilliant. No, I think that's a great place to stop. So, where can people encounter or find your work, your writing and?
Well, I do more sort of cultural commentary with a magazine called The Critic, which I write for sort of roughly on a monthly basis, and then bits and pieces in academic journals. You could follow me on Twitter. I try to remember to put stuff up on there. And I've got a book. At the moment, I'm working on a book on Ratzinger, which I hope will be coming out next year. So keep an eye out for that, if you're a sucker for punishment.
Well, thank you so much. It's been a fascinating discussion. If you enjoyed this podcast and things similar to it, please like and subscribe and follow our channel. Thank you.